that we need to clip. I'm sure Brian can clip that out.
Okay.
All right, so I got a notice that it started recording. It tells me be sure to let everyone know they're being recorded per our privacy policy. All right. And so I'll start after a 3, 2, 1 countdown. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Evaluating Supply Chain. I'm your host, Ben Locwin. In this segment, we'll be taking focus on supply chain, reasons for current day challenges, and the best ways to go about resolving them for your organization. I'm pleased to introduce my co-conspirator for this episode, Joe Shedlawski. Joe, welcome. Would you please give the audience a little bit of introductory background?
Hi, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be participating in this exercise, this event. I'm a supply chain guy by background, most all of my career in supply chain, even though my college education, my college degree was in biology. I was very fortunate to be able to combine the supply chain knowledge that I had learned from certifications as well as my MBA with that biology background in the field of vaccines and biotechnology. And I had the opportunity to work for a company that was producing some classic vaccines, but also was beginning to specialize more in a new form of conjugated vaccines and introducing some pretty large scale products. It was also becoming a global, very global player in the vaccines arena during the years that I served as the director of supply chain for the global vaccines business. So we were really at an interesting point, an inflection in my career where I had been working in pharmaceuticals and consumer healthcare, and I had developed some expertise in things like sales and operations planning, enterprise resource planning systems, and so forth. But the challenges in biotechnical kind of work and vaccines business are indeed immense. They're very different for a number of reasons. And so it's my pleasure to share some experiences, some things that I learned that worked very well for us, some mistakes that we made along the way as we perfected a supply chain that would become more resilient, more global in nature, and certainly more able to withstand and sustain more major changes in both demand and supply as we went on through the years that I spent in vaccines.
Nice. That's a great background, thanks. And as you definitely know, the things that we do in the industry can't possibly be done without appropriate supply chain. I mean, if there's just not material, then nothing happens. So it's really, in my mind, top of the food chain. The first question I would ask you is, what do you consider to be some of the most common supply chain weaknesses that you've and our audience also likely to have seen?
Well, I think the good news for our vaccines group at that point was that we were growing very rapidly. But a supply chain phenomenon that we like to talk about is draining the swamp and the rocks start to appear. If your boat is floating on a pretty high lake, you're impervious actually to the rocks that are in the bottom. But as you start to drain the water, you start to put pressure on a supply chain system, those rocks start to appear. Those weaknesses that we didn't know would stop us or would impede progress or would actually cause us to get ahead of ourselves on demand. We're actually starting to overpromise and underdeliver on a too frequent basis. Those things were starting to appear due to this period of rapid growth, both in product portfolio, but also in global presence. We had a very good regulatory team, and they were so good at getting approvals in more countries and getting more bids on vaccination programs in various states within the United States as well as internationally, that it was tough to keep some supply and demand in balance, not only in the short term, but more, in our longer term plans and projections.
Interesting.
And a situation like that presents different constraints, different bottlenecks that appear, things that we never really shored up in our system so carefully, or, for example, made sure that we were we're running certain processes with careful attention to downtime, and lunch and breaks and different shifts and so forth, were not so much of an issue until that system was under pressure, and until that water in the lake started to drop and those rocks started to appear. So the question would become, how could we anticipate the next problem, the next shortage, the next bottleneck, if you will, because these things change over time. Who would think, for example, that a company that could develop, brilliant vaccine processes that were rather complex to put together a vaccine with multiple valencies, multiple, active parts to it, in many stages that would involve a couple plants to manufacture, could run into a bottleneck in the vial filling process. That to me, at least, always seemed to be the most straightforward. You've gone through this long process of procuring materials, of growing some products. It's a little different in vaccines because we're growing, we're not assembling or making things as much as growing them, and get through all this and run into a problem where we just can't fill enough. So we had to be a little bit resourceful in our use of capacity. The easy answer would be to say, get more filling capacity. That's a long-term proposition. We also took a look at our hand and said, we've got a couple options we can exercise here. We can divert some of the demand actually into syringes. We have syringe capacity. I did a study on that and said, lo and behold, we get more doses out of a batch of product if we can make it and sell it in syringes than in multi-dose vials. It seemed counterintuitive, but when we looked at all of the losses in process and all the overfills and so forth, we said, well, that's one thing we can do to mitigate this circumstance. Another thing we kind of had to do at some point was to recommend to, in fact, to the federal government and some other international governments that they start with a lower dosage. Instead of administering 4 doses per infant, maybe right now it would be 3, for example, so that we could extend supply and at least get more individuals vaccinated and somewhat immunized, and delay the later dose until we had adequate supply. So we started to take control of supply and demand given the circumstances. And we also did something else I think very important, is we changed the way we were forecasting. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that too. Forecasts are always problematic in any business or any industry, but particularly in vaccines, where we had such variability in demand as we were entering new markets with new products, and we had some competition. So the question would be, would we get this bid or this award or not? And we try to predict one at a time. Another way to do this, though, would be to more or less control the demand, to say this is our upper limit. So let's decide how we fill that bucket of demand and what promises we will make. Demand forecasting in vaccines, when I started on that scene, when the business was relatively small, was based on statistics, based on history. History became worse than useless. It became kind of harmful because it was taking us in the wrong direction sometimes, just relying on an extrapolation of the past. So we had to get closer to our markets. We had to get closer to some of our international affiliates and to the timing of regulatory approvals and so forth to get a better handle on future demand. And I'm not talking about future meaning next month or two, but really start looking further and further out into the future. A year, 2 years, to see what changes we need to make structurally, what capital investments we need to make to keep building this business, to keep it on the trajectory that the demand could take us if we were capable of handling it.
Mm-hmm. Now, on this idea of forecasting, it's interesting because you mentioned, lowering the water level, and you start to see a lot of those rocks. And to me, forecasting is almost like the predictive analysis of where might rocks come up. Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to look ahead to say, as this water level keeps lowering, where might we see the next rock? What size rock is it? That kind of thing. And it seems like a lot of these tools you mentioned, so demand control, production planning, constraints, bottlenecks, are squarely in the realm of lean. How would you say you've implemented lean versus maybe Goldrat's theory of constraints or any other methods that you found to be most helpful there?
Yes, it's a very good question, good point. And we did some work on the constraint side of it, as I mentioned, in bottleneck, identification and recognizing that bottlenecks change over time, and you can identify them, and you can focus your efforts to exploit, the output at the bottleneck. But also lean, we think about lean as elimination of or reduction to the extent possible of waste in a supply chain, and waste includes, to me, it includes variability, which is, we talk about Six Sigma as well.
Mm-hmm.
We had some processes which were not very lean and not very Six Sigma, quite honestly. When you're growing product, what do we expect? A variation in yield, sometimes in output. We also had processes for quality control, sampling and testing, which sometimes were dependent on growth themselves. It would take some time, but those had a lot of variability in lead time. So we started to shore up on those and ask why. And we put together some teams that would focus on one problem, kind of like the Kaizen events that we talk about today. And we were just doing it naturally, just doing what comes naturally. Put a quality control person, a supply chain person, operations person, maybe a regulatory together, and say, how can we standardize some of these processes that have multiple links in them? And sometimes it's process simplification. We took one process, for example, as I mentioned, for sampling and testing, down from a 14 to a 4-step handoff.
Wow.
So different. Yeah, so there were a lot of opportunities to reduce complexity in our processes and in our communications. Lean on the factory floor is one thing, and for the most part, I think things were going well, but we also mentioned, as I said, that vial filling was an issue. There were a lot of reasons for that. So why? Part of it was, let's get better predictive maintenance in place so that we're not subjected to the line going down, or to that we're filling that are somehow out of spec and we're wasting product. So we can improve our yields with better, predictive maintenance, scheduled maintenance and repairs. Focus more on SOPs and training. So we, directed some efforts in those areas as well to do, again, what would come naturally. Focus on the bottleneck and exploit that bottleneck to try to get as much as you can out of it, not just by working it all the time, but really trying to focus improvement efforts in those areas where they count. We had sent some folks out to a theory of constraints lecture a few years before. We realized, for example, within our larger business, not just vaccines, but in pharmaceuticals, we may not have been, focusing on the right things. We had packaging lines that could run faster and faster, and they were making the headlines around the plant, but they weren't exploiting the system anymore. They weren't improving throughput. They weren't improving, ultimately, ability to sell, to make and sell products. So we had to start focusing efforts on where we could get a tangible improvement in terms of output. And output, forecasting demand is one thing, but we were essentially forecasting what a system under stress can produce. And that's not easy either. And I think we changed our thinking there from, here's what the manufacturer says, or here's what, we should be able to do, or we had a really good week last week, so here's what we should be able to continue to do. But rather, just take a look at actual demonstrated output, quality output, over a few weeks or a sizable enough period of time that it dampens out the highs and lows and gives us a workable number, workable average.
So like the real voice of the process instead of just the voice of the business.
Yes, and the voice of the business was definitely calling and knocking. Opportunity was there and knocking, and we didn't want to under deliver, though. At the same time, we want to be realistic and make the best decisions, because otherwise, the product would disappear on a first come first served basis rather than on a strategic basis. So how do we grow this business strategically from a commercial side, with consistent capability to deliver as promised, while at the same time internally we're struggling with our needs to improve capacity, resiliency, consistency of output.
Right. Yeah. So that brings me to my next question then, which is, when you've got a cross-functional, multidisciplinary set of teams working on all this, whether you call it a Kaizen event, you've got all hands on deck, as part of these inputs. Do you have any recommendations about how best to assign departmental responsibility and getting everyone involved who needs to be involved?
Yes, and that's important too, and especially I should point out that as this business grew, in size, it also grew in complexity. So there were now 3 different plant sites that we're talking about. There's a corporate headquarters, which is separate from the biggest, of the plant sites, which is where I and a lot of our cross-functional teams were located. So how does this all come together? How do we assign responsibilities? How do we get onto one set of numbers that we're promising to the customer, and we're also internally, we're trying to make this demand number and this supply number, and this is how we're basing all of our plans, and who's responsible then for developing and assigning the teams to support, for example, improvements on those bottlenecks or implementing those lean processes. The best answer I can give you is that it is something that came out of a structured sales and operations planning process, where the president of the division is the ultimate, executive, the person who has all of the functional heads reporting to him or her. And it's at those meetings, in that structured, repeating, monthly cycle of meetings and discussions and reviews, that we determined what our true demand and supply plans and inventory plans would be, what our backlogs would be, and where we had gaps. And where we had gaps, which ones were the most significant, and where those gaps are the most significant is where we need to put the appropriate people on those teams. And it's not, it's not just a case of saying who's got spare time in a department, and we'll do the best we can, but those teams have to have some specific goals too. So they really have to put on the right folks for a certain period of time. If we didn't have this central kind of sales and operations planning, I think we all got a bit distracted with so many different projects, so many different efforts, okay? And they may not have all been pointing in the same direction until we had some kind of a cohesive process that says, we're putting this team in place, we're assigning these individuals because we have a goal, which is a subset of the larger goal, is to close this gap that's preventing us from meeting our sales and operations plan objectives. So we kind of knit that together to a sales and operations plan process. And it's not easy, especially if it starts out kind of in a crisis situation, where I remember one of the first meetings was pretty tough because we're coming right up to the top of the division and showing graphs where if we keep doing what we're doing with this major new product line, our inventory is going to hit 0 I guess it was almost a year from now, but it's going to keep going further and further into the red. In other words, we're planning ourselves into a real disaster here in supply chain, right, if we keep doing the same thing. So we say, well, it's not just, can you work the line a little harder? It's something bigger than that. Then some needs for some specific improvement projects started to develop. And let's say, how can we systematically close that projection gap? And how can we see how that's working from month to month by a systematic review? And you'll see quickly if your demand plan or your supply plan have a bias in them. You look at about 3 months of history on those plans. And if they're off in the same direction 3 months in a row, that pretty much is tripping a switch that says there's something fundamentally flawed with our assumptions. So whenever we have these sales and operations plan meetings and we chart progress and plan more progress for the future, we are also charting and recording our assumptions and saying how accurate are we in developing forecasts and supply plans. It's partly based upon our assumptions, right? So when we see that we're chronically off in one direction, it's probably time to revisit our assumptions.
Excellent. Yeah. Now, I'm looking at the clock here, and in the last couple minutes, I think, given the brilliance of your background in this space, far be it from me to steer where we should go for the next question or outro. So any parting thoughts that you think you haven't covered yet that you would like to close on for the audience?
I think communications are, as I like to say, 95% of the world's problems are somehow rooted in a communications issue, right? So We can have the equipment, we can have the knowledge base, a lot of people, we can have the resources and facilities and materials, but if we don't have a good, solid, consistent communication process, if we're not really all working towards the same objectives and same goals and same timeframes, we're not going to be as ultimately successful as we can be. And growing pains, kind of a nice problem to have. It means you're growing, but they are painful. And the old paradigms about how we plan and orchestrate the work and how we do the best we can and it'll work out, sometimes just start to fall by the wayside, and we say, how can we do something, not just try to do what we're doing and do it a little bit better, but how can we do something very different in order to really be better? It's harder to achieve and maintain a small percent improvement than a big one. And I say that because a small percent improvement means you're probably just trying to run a little faster or jump a little higher. But this was about a new communications process, top down, sales and operations planning, clear direction, clear priorities, consistent communication of the goals and objectives around the organization. And I think that's the parting thought that I would give, because that kind of ties all these other things that we've talked about together. They all fall under the heading of kind of rallying the team around a set of clear goals and communicating ongoing the results versus those goals.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I think it was Jim Womack who said, different isn't always better, but better is always different.
Ah, yes. Better
And
is very different.
I concur.
Better is very different.
All right, Joe. Well, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. I'm sure the audience has gotten a lot out of this. And for those who have joined us for this session, please feel free to send us a message, chime in, use the communication tools, and we can certainly get answers to you from this particular session. So again, thank you for being here, Joe. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. Bye now.